My name is Natalie Parker, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the family's quiet joke. I'm 32 now, but sometimes I still feel like that awkward kid sitting at the end of the long dining table, pretending I didn't hear my cousins whispering about my hand-me-down shoes, or the way my mum's old minivan coughed down their fancy suburban driveway. We grew up in the same town, but it might as well have been different worlds. They lived in big houses with manicured lawns and granite kitchen islands that looked like something out of a catalogue. My mum and I lived in a rental duplex with carpets that never smelled quite right, no matter how much she scrubbed them. I learned early on to laugh at myself before anyone else could. If they called my clothes thrift store chic, I'd roll my eyes and act like I didn't care. But inside, each comment found its mark. And over time, it planted something deep in me, a quiet, stubborn promise that someday, somehow, I'd have something they couldn't mock. Christmas dinners were the worst. I still see it so clearly. The fake warmth of twinkling lights, the smell of glazed ham, my cousins huddled together, whispering behind their champagne glasses. My aunt, their mum, would just beam with pride while they bragged about their new cars, their college dorms, their European spring breaks. And then someone's eyes would slide toward me, sitting there in my one nice sweater, and the conversation would drift to charity work. As if my entire life was just a cautionary tale. If you asked them now, they'd say it was just harmless teasing, family banter. But they don't know how it felt to stand there, at 16, watching them roll their eyes when I said I was going to get out of that duplex one day. They don't know the nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every smirk, every dismissive joke, every little reminder that I'd never be one of them. They were right, in a way. I was never one of them. And that turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. I guess the real shift happened when I finally moved out at 24. By then, Mum had remarried and moved 2 states away with her new husband. I stayed behind, working 2 jobs, mornings at a little downtown bakery, nights waitressing at a bar near campus. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. My apartment was a cramped 1-bedroom on the top floor of an old brick building. The paint peeled in the corners, the pipes moaned when I ran the shower too long, and the carpet was this awful shade of mustard yellow that no amount of cheap rugs could hide. But when I turned that old key in the lock for the first time, I felt something I'd never felt in that duplex. Safe. Independent. Free from their pity. At first, I didn't even invite the family over. Why would I? But word got around. That Christmas, at my aunt's house, someone asked where I was living now. I mentioned my new place, and the next thing I knew, my cousins insisted they'd come see it. They made it sound casual, like they just wanted to swing by before dinner, but I could already feel the way their curiosity twisted into something sharper. I spent the whole week before cleaning every corner, scrubbing the bathroom tile until my hands cracked, borrowing a steam cleaner for that stubborn carpet. I bought a new thrifted couch that didn't sag and found cheap throw pillows in a clearance bin. I even splurged on a second-hand coffee maker because I wanted to offer them something. Anything to make it feel enough. They showed up 30 minutes late, wearing matching designer coats, all smiles and polite curiosity. For a moment, it felt almost normal, like maybe we'd turned a corner, like maybe they'd see how hard I was trying. They did their tour with fake admiration, but it didn't take long for the cracks to show. One cousin wrinkled her nose at the hallway. Another made a joke about the vintage vibes, not in a nice way. When they got to the kitchen, they giggled about how tiny it was, how my oven was practically an antique. They didn't even hide it that well. One of them leaned over the window ledge and said, loud enough for me to hear, "Can you believe she pays to live here?" I remember nodding along, pretending I didn't care, offering them coffee that no one touched. I watched them snap a few photos on their phones, probably to show their parents later. Natalie's new place. Can you believe this dump? I laughed at their jokes because that's what I'd always done. But something inside me shifted while I stood there with my thrifted mug cooling in my hands. After they left, I sat on that new couch for hours, staring at the ceiling with its hairline cracks. I could feel every word echoing in my chest. Rat hole. Cheap. Poor Natalie. The same old chorus, just updated for adulthood. But this time, something was different. I wasn't a kid anymore. I didn't have to stand there and take it forever. If they thought that tiny apartment was the punchline to my sad little story, they were about to find out it was the first line of a much bigger one. I didn't sleep much that night. I opened my laptop and started running numbers. Rent, taxes, maintenance, small business loans, words I barely understood at first. I watched free webinars, borrowed books from the library, scribbled notes until my eyes burned. For the first time, I didn't just daydream about someday. I plotted it, floor by floor, brick by brick. I didn't have anyone cheering me on. Mum sent the occasional text. Friends drifted in and out, but those cousins, they were my fuel. Every snide comment, every snicker. They didn't know it yet, but they were building something for me. They were paying my rent in resolve. And that rat hole they mocked. Turns out that was just my foot in the door. The next few years looked ordinary from the outside. If you asked my cousins back then, they'd probably say I was still scraping by, stuck in that same apartment with its stained carpet and rattling pipes. And I let them think that. I kept my head down, smiled at their holiday gossip, pretended not to notice when they'd whisper about how Natalie was wasting her 20s. But behind my faded door, my nights turned into lessons no college ever taught me. I'd come home after a double shift at the bakery, peel off my greasy apron, and sit cross-legged on the floor with a cheap laptop propped on a stack of old textbooks. I devoured everything I could find about real estate, zoning laws, renovation loans, rent control. It became an obsession, this idea that maybe my greatest insult could turn into my greatest leverage. I remember the day I saw the for sale sign go up in front of my building. I still had less than $2,000 in my bank account, but my heartbeat flipped anyway. Everyone said it was a dump that no one would touch. Old plumbing, a leaking roof, tenants who were always late on rent. I saw potential. All those late nights added up to something, enough confidence to walk into the local credit union with my first rough plan scribbled in a coffee-stained notebook. The loan officer looked at me like I was delusional. Maybe I was. But I'd been laughed at before, and what they didn't understand was that I'd survived worse. After 2 rejections and 1 desperate phone call to a community development program, I found a local mentor willing to take a chance. He helped me draft a business proposal that didn't make me sound like a lost waitress with a pipe dream. I signed those papers 6 months later, standing in the same lobby my cousins had once mocked. The day the keys hit my palm, I felt equal parts terror and freedom. My name was on the deed now. Cracked bricks, busted plumbing, late-paying tenants and all. What no one knew was that I didn't evict a single tenant. I didn't jack up the rent overnight or slap my name on the mailbox. I just fixed what I could piece by piece. I spent every dime I made on repairs, patching the roof, swapping broken tiles, repainting those nicotine-yellowed walls. Weekends, I scrubbed floors next to a hired handyman because I couldn't afford a crew yet. Some nights I fell asleep on a blow-up mattress in an empty unit because it was easier than driving back across town. I'd wake up sore and cold, but I felt something I'd never felt in my cousin's guest rooms: pride. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And here's the part they'd never believe. They helped me keep it. One by one, my tenants brought in friends, young couples, grad students, single parents. Word got out that the building was improving, but the rent stayed fair. Within 2 years, I was collecting enough to cover the mortgage, the taxes, and still tuck away a little profit. It didn't make me rich overnight. There were leaks I couldn't afford to fix, tenants who ghosted, contractors who cut corners when they thought I wouldn't notice, but every challenge made me sharper. I learned to read people the way I used to read my cousin's fake smiles across the dinner table. Then the market shifted. The city started pouring money into the neighbourhood. New coffee shops, a bike lane, a fancy grocery store. Property values climbed. I could have sold the building then and made more than I'd ever dreamed at 24. But selling wasn't the point. Keeping it was. So I refinanced, invested in better plumbing, replaced the entire third-floor windows when the old frames started rotting. I hired a real property manager, someone who could handle late-night calls when the heater broke in January. Bit by bit, my cheap apartment turned into a place people wanted, needed, to live. Funny thing is, I'd catch my cousins at family parties still sneering about that part of town. One of them even said once, offhand, that he and his girlfriend had found a surprisingly decent deal on rent nearby. I just nodded, biting my tongue to keep the grin inside. They had no idea they'd be moving into my building. No clue that every rent check they wrote landed eventually in my account, the same account I once kept pennies in, counting quarters for laundry. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't crave it. What I wanted was already unfolding, one lease at a time behind the scenes. They say revenge is best served cold, but I found out it tastes even sweeter when no one sees it coming. What made it even better was that no one suspected a thing. My cousins went on living their shiny lives, dropping passive-aggressive hints about my scrappy little apartment whenever family gatherings forced us back into the same room. They'd ask how the neighbourhood was. Was it still sketchy? Was I still fighting roaches? Was the rent still dirt cheap? I'd smile, sip my watered-down wine, and let them think whatever they needed to think to keep their egos intact. Meanwhile, my name was nowhere to be found on mailboxes or rental websites. I hid behind a small management company, just a modest name on the lease papers. When I finally upgraded my own unit, moving out of that tiny starter apartment into something slightly bigger 2 floors down, they didn't even notice. It was the same address after all. In their minds, I'd plateaued, always one step behind, forever the girl they pitied. But every time they signed a lease renewal, every time they bragged at the dinner table about how clever they were for finding affordable rent in an up-and-coming neighbourhood, I felt that quiet, delicious satisfaction. It was like getting to replay all those humiliations from our childhood, the cheap gifts, the backhanded comments, the nights I'd lie awake wondering if I'd ever measure up. But this time, I was the one holding the strings. It wasn't about draining them dry. I never overcharged. In fact, my rent stayed fair even when the market went wild. I kept units livable, safe, affordable enough that word of mouth kept them full. I didn't want their money out of spite. I wanted the freedom it gave me, the leverage, the proof that you could build something bigger than the people who once made you feel so small. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'd walk the creaky halls of the building just to remind myself this was real. I'd run my fingers along the doorframes, listen to the muted hum of life behind each door. Students pulling all-nighters, young families putting babies to bed. Even the cousins, who'd come stumbling home after a night out, clueless that the landlord they occasionally bitched about at brunch was the same girl they used to mock for wearing off-brand sneakers. I played the long game. No social media flexing, no fancy car parked out front. I kept my day job longer than I needed to because it made the story believable. Natalie, the girl scraping by. They'd see my old clothes, my same battered tote bag, my coffee thermos with the chipped lid, and assume I was just stuck. In reality, I was reinvesting every extra dollar. When the first building was stable enough, I bought a second property down the street, this time with a partner, a young contractor who didn't mind the sweat equity. We split profits 50-50, but the work taught me twice as much. I learned how to negotiate with city inspectors, chase down deadbeat plumbers, read a spreadsheet upside down. I learned that you could spend $5,000 on a new roof and add $50,000 in value overnight. All this time, family dinners went on like they always had. My aunt would beam while my cousins bragged about their big new jobs or engagement rings. They'd ask me, with that same tight smile, how my little apartment was holding up. I'd shrug and say, same old, same old. Some nights I wondered if I should come clean, just drop the truth across the table like a grenade and watch the fake smiles melt away. But then I'd think about how much I loved the power of them not knowing. Because the truth was, every time they handed over that rent check, so casual, so smug about how smart they were for beating the city's rising costs, they were helping me pay off the mortgage faster, helping me stack up savings for the next project. They were the reason I never had to beg the bank for another risky loan. Their rent made me debt-free in my 30s, a reality they'd never guess while they juggled car payments and credit card bills for vacations they'd forget by next year. Sometimes, when my oldest cousin bragged about how his rent was so much lower than his friends downtown, I had to excuse myself from the table to keep from laughing. I'd stand by the bathroom sink, hands braced on the porcelain, and see my reflection. The same face they used to call plain, unremarkable, easy to overlook. I'd think, let them overlook you, Natalie. They'll never see it coming. By the time I turned 30, I owned 3 buildings. Nothing fancy. No high-rises, no doormen, no marble lobbies. Just solid, honest apartments with good bones and good people. My mentor, the one who helped me draft that first proposal, said he'd never seen someone play the long game so quietly. It wasn't about revenge for him. For me, maybe it still was. But it was also about something bigger, proving to myself that I could be the kind of woman I'd needed when I was 16, sitting at the end of that table, pretending I didn't hear the whispers. So I let them whisper. Let them keep guessing. Let them keep mocking what they thought was my tiny, cheap little corner of the world. Because while they laughed, they never once realised they were standing on ground I owned, brick by brick, lease by lease, built with every insult they ever tossed my way. It was my aunt's birthday that finally cracked it open. I'd almost skipped it. I'd been travelling back and forth meeting a new property manager for the latest building I'd bought near the waterfront. But Mum guilt-tripped me about family ties, so I threw on my old black dress and drove across town with a bottle of mid-range wine I knew they'd judge anyway. Walking into that house felt like stepping straight back into my teenage years. Same overpriced decor, same smell of cinnamon candles and expensive cheese trays, same cousins perched around the kitchen island, laughing in that way they do, heads close, eyes darting around to make sure they've got an audience. They'd barely let me hang up my coat before the questions started. So, Natalie, still living in that little place of yours, how's the neighbourhood these days? Not too dangerous, I hope. They always asked like they cared, but the smirk gave it away. They loved the idea that I was stuck in the same old story. I laughed it off like I always did, but something felt different this time. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I'd just spent too many nights alone, letting the secret feel heavier than it should. Maybe it was the way my cousin's wife, tipsy on white wine, piped up to say how smart they were to find an affordable apartment in my run-down part of town. She turned to me with a wink. You should look into it, Nat. Maybe you could finally get out of that tiny box. I just nodded, biting my tongue so hard I tasted blood. Dinner dragged on. The usual show. Fancy plates, forced toasts, small talk about vacation homes and job promotions. Every so often, they'd loop back to my living situation like it was a funny anecdote they couldn't help but pick at. One cousin bragged about how he and his girlfriend loved their apartment so much more than the overpriced units downtown. They'd just renewed for another year. Best deal in the city, he said proudly. I stirred my potatoes and let the fire build in my chest. At some point, I caught my reflection in the patio door. Same face they'd underestimated for 3 decades. Same quiet posture. Same polite smile. I thought about my tenants who'd never know the kind of money these people blew on spa days. I thought about my buildings, fully paid off because I'd let them keep talking while I did the work. And I thought, maybe it was time. It started small. I set down my fork, waited for their attention to drift back to me like it always did. I asked my cousin about his lease. Did he like the landlord, the unit, the neighbourhood now that it was changing so fast? He went on about how the landlord was a bit hands-off but good enough, how the hallways were finally painted, how the new security system made his girlfriend feel safer at night. I felt my lips curve into a smile I hadn't used in years, the one that says I'm done playing dumb. I leaned back in my chair, tapping my nails against the stem of my wine glass, just loud enough to quiet the table. You know, I said lightly, it's funny you love that apartment so much, especially since you've been paying me rent for 3 years. The silence was instant. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Someone dropped a piece of bread onto the floor, but no one moved to pick it up. My cousin's face went pale, then flushed red, like his brain was stuttering trying to process the joke. Wait, what? He asked, half laughing, half choking. You're kidding. I didn't blink. No, I'm not. I bought the building years ago. I bought the first one you made fun of, actually. The rat hole you all laughed about. And when that worked, I bought the one down the street, and then another. You'd be surprised how many people you know have been paying my mortgage, including you. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My aunt's wineglass trembled in her hand. Someone, I think my oldest cousin, tried to brush it off. That's not possible. You don't even... you live there. Yeah, I said. I live there because I own it. It was never about the decor or the neighbourhood. It was about building something that would outlive every insult you ever threw at me. The room felt too small for a moment. All that old air, stale with years of jokes I'd swallowed and nights I'd spent awake planning what they'd never see coming. I didn't need to shout or gloat. The look on their faces was enough. The realisation they'd been mocking me while putting money in my pocket. No one knew what to say. My cousin's girlfriend opened her mouth, then shut it again. The tipsy wife who'd told me to get out of my box was staring at her plate like it might rescue her from the tension. And me? I felt lighter than I had in years. I didn't want their praise. I didn't want their apologies. I wanted them to sit with the truth. The cheap apartment was never the punchline. It was the foundation. That dinner didn't last much longer. Conversations turned clumsy. Eyes darted anywhere but my face. I stayed calm, polite even, until Mum caught my arm by the coat rack on my way out, half proud, half confused. "Why didn't you ever tell them?" she whispered. I shrugged, because they never asked. Not really. I drove home that night with the windows cracked open, the cold air biting at my cheeks, laughter bubbling up in my chest like a secret I didn't have to keep anymore. And when I parked outside that same old brick building, my building, I looked up at the windows glowing warm above me. All those families, couples, cousins. Let them mock my cheap apartment. Let them call it small. They can call it whatever they want. It still pays me every single month. Back in my apartment that night, I didn't celebrate. I didn't pour a glass of cheap champagne or call anyone to gloat. I just sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, letting the quiet settle in. It was funny. I'd spent so many years picturing that moment, their faces frozen mid-bite, the disbelief, the pale shock. And yet, once it was done, it felt less like revenge and more like closing a door that had been creaking open my whole life. In the days that followed, the family group chat went strangely quiet. The cousins who used to pepper me with little jabs at every holiday were suddenly careful with their words. One or two even sent awkward texts pretending they'd known something about my building all along, like they'd been in on the plan. I let them pretend. It wasn't worth the energy to correct them. A week later, my oldest cousin's girlfriend, the same one who'd bragged about finding the best deal in the city, knocked on my door. She looked embarrassed, holding a plate of store-bought cookies like a peace offering. She said they'd had a plumbing issue and wondered if I could help speed up the repairs. For a second, I wanted to tell her to figure it out herself, but I didn't. I called the plumber, made sure he fixed it the next morning. It wasn't about punishing them, not anymore. Word spread slowly through the extended family. At my uncle's barbecue that spring, I noticed the way conversations shifted when I walked up. My aunt poured me the good wine for the first time ever, her smile stiff at the corners. Nobody dared say cheap apartment anymore. They asked about the market instead, about rental trends, about how the neighbourhood was changing. One cousin pulled me aside, tried to talk me into investing with him in some sketchy short-term rental scheme. I smiled and told him I'd think about it. I didn't. Funny thing was, the more they tried to act impressed, the less I needed it. I'd always thought I wanted their respect, some version of an apology for every time they made me feel small. But what I really wanted was to see myself without needing their reflection. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wander through the building like I did in the early days. Only now the halls were freshly painted, the plumbing reliable, the mailboxes new. I'd hear the low hum of families making dinner, babies crying, dogs barking at delivery guys. Life, steady and real, paid for by every insult that once kept me awake. Mum came to visit more after that dinner. She'd sit on my couch, still old but draped with a new throw I'd splurged on, and ask questions she'd never asked before. How did you learn all this? Who helped you? How did you keep it secret for so long? I'd tell her bits and pieces, about the late nights reading city code, the early mornings meeting contractors, the deals that nearly fell apart. She'd nod, eyes misty, squeezing my hand like she was holding on to the girl I'd been in that run-down duplex all those years ago. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the lobby window, the same face but different now. Not because I'd grown richer, but because I'd grown out of that old version of myself, the one who flinched when people laughed, who second-guessed every idea before it could bloom. My cousins, they still live their glossy lives. Some moved on to bigger places as their incomes grew, bragging about condos with rooftop pools and private gyms. But a few stayed, and every time they dropped off rent checks or set up their autopay without a second thought, it reminded me that I'd built my foundation out of their doubt. They might never say thank you, but they didn't have to. There were still small moments that made me grin. Once, at a family dinner months later, my oldest cousin was ranting about his new landlord at a downtown high-rise. Bad maintenance, rent hikes, 0 repairs. He looked at me like I might sympathise. "Must be nice," he said, "to have such a laid-back situation where you live. No drama, stable rent." I almost laughed out loud. I just nodded and told him, "It's good to know who's taking care of you, isn't it?" He didn't catch it. Or maybe he did. Maybe they all did by then, and that was enough. What surprised me most was how little I felt the urge to rub it in. The revelation had been the release. The real reward was waking up every day knowing I didn't need to prove myself to people who'd never really seen me anyway. My building stood there, brick and mortar, a testament to every late night, every whispered insult I'd folded into something stronger. Sometimes I still felt that old sting when I heard their voices at gatherings, the same tone that once made my stomach twist. But then I'd remember I could go home, turn my key, and stand in the middle of a hallway I owned outright. That cheap apartment they mocked was just my first seed. The whole garden was mine now, and the best part, they'd keep watering it for years to come. Some mornings now, I wake up before sunrise just to stand at my window and watch the neighbourhood come alive. Delivery trucks rumble down the street, porch lights click off one by one, and I think about the way this place has changed, not just the buildings, but me too. It's funny how something so ordinary, a row of old bricks and windows that rattle when the wind hits, can carry so much of who you used to be and who you're becoming. I still live here. People ask me why all the time. Why not sell it all and move somewhere fancy, get a penthouse overlooking the skyline, find a condo with marble floors and someone to park my car for me? But when I open my front door and step into the hallway, I see every patch of drywall I repainted myself, every squeaky stair I used to dread because I thought it made me look cheap. Now I hear those creaks like an old song that reminds me what I've survived. Sometimes tenants stop me in the lobby. They don't know I'm the owner. To them, I'm just Natalie who lives upstairs, the one who calls the plumber when the water heater breaks, the one who makes sure the hallway lights are replaced before they flicker out for good. I like it that way. I like knowing that this isn't about a flex or a trophy, or an Instagram post with a shiny key in my hand. It's about the real thing, the walls that kept me warm when I didn't know if I'd make rent, the roof I paid for in overtime shifts and dollar store dinners. My mum sometimes sits across from me at my kitchen table, the same one she once helped me haul up 3 flights of stairs because I couldn't afford movers. She still shakes her head like she can't quite believe it. She tells me she's proud. I believe her. But it's different now. I don't need her pride the way I used to. I let it land where it wants to, grateful but not desperate for it to stick. My cousins. They still show up at family dinners, still brag about their new jobs, their next vacations, the shiny things they think will keep them ahead. Maybe they do. Maybe they'll outgrow my buildings someday, buy places of their own. That's fine with me. By the time they figure it out, I'll already be on to the next quiet move. Maybe a cafe down the street, maybe another block of apartments, maybe something that has nothing to do with real estate at all. I've learned the real power isn't in the reveal. It's in the silence that follows. The look on someone's face when they realise they misjudged you for so long they stopped seeing you altogether. And by the time they notice, you're too far ahead for their opinion to matter. If I could go back to that 16-year-old girl at the end of the dinner table, the one who sat there holding her paper plate while her cousins laughed about her shoes, I think I'd just stand behind her, hands on her shoulders, and tell her, "You don't have to prove anything tonight. Just keep your head down. Keep moving. One day they'll live in a building you own. One day their rent will pay for your freedom. But the real win won't be that check hitting your account every month. It'll be this. The morning you wake up, brew your cheap coffee in a chipped mug and realise you don't care if they see you or not. You see you, and you like what you see." I know now that this neighbourhood, with its old bricks and peeling paint, isn't something to be ashamed of. It's my reminder that you can build something solid from scraps, that you can survive being overlooked and mocked and still come out the other side with your own keys in your pocket. So let them talk. Let them move out someday. Let them gossip about who owns what. Let them brag about how smart they were for getting such a good deal. I'll smile and hold the door open, just like I always have. Because this cheap apartment, the one they thought would hold me down, turned out to be the thing that set me free.